What do you think of when I say physiognomy? Have you heard of that? When I search physiognomy online, I get all sorts of different results. One of the most popular ones is sanpakugan. San means three, paku or haku means white. It's the crazy eyes with whites on three sides. It's part of this Japanese face reading, which is like moment to moment expressions, reading that on people. That's not what I'm talking about with physiognomy. Also, if you search physiognomy on YouTube, you'll see people talking about reading the future from Donald Trump's face, which I think is sort of like a palm reading, but the face. That's not what I'm talking about with physiognomy either. But maybe you've seen images on social media like this. This is what an honest forehead looks like, or a deceitful forehead. These are trustworthy eyebrows, scheming eyebrows, that kind of stuff. Not the moment-to-moment changes in the eyebrows and the forehead, but characterizing people's personalities and their values by their features, right? Maybe you've seen some of this. Now, maybe you've seen scientific research like this. This paper is titled Facing a Psychopath, Detecting the Dark Triad from Emotionally Neutral Faces Using Prototypes from the Personality Thesaurus. Now, in this paper, they're talking about the dark triad. That's narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism. Basically, random people can detect the dark triad from faces. If you took, let's say, 10 photos of faces, 5 of them are psychopaths and 5 of them are normal people. If you went around your town and showed people these 10 photos and asked which ones are the psychopaths, the people will do better over time than you would expect if they were just guessing at random. So people are picking up on subtle clues to find psychopaths, and all they have is a photo. So, of course, they're looking at things like the eyes, the eyebrows, forehead, hairline, nose, jaw, this sort of stuff. How they're actually able to some degree, identify psychopaths based off of their face. In fact, this maybe seems more reasonable to you if I were to grab 1,000 Americans, 1,000 voting Americans, and put them in front of you. You might be pretty good at guessing which ones voted for Trump and which ones voted for Biden. Even if I were to dress them, so that way you wouldn't see any pins or something like that. They're all just in white t-shirt and jeans. You would probably be decent at guessing which ones voted which ways. You'd be much better than a coin flip. So because of this, you will occasionally see people online say, physiognomy is real. You really can judge a book by its cover, something like that. But let's look at how deep this rabbit hole goes. The BBC released an interesting video on YouTube. I'm using it with fair use, providing commentary. They had multiple pairs of people that were doppelgangers. Now, doppelgangers, the word comes from German. It's sort of a ghostly, supernatural copy of another person, sometimes like an evil twin kind of deal. But we use that term today just to refer to very extremely similar looking people who aren't born from the same parents, right? When computers were used to perform an analysis of how similar these doppelganger pairs were in the BBC show, they showed that John and Neil and David and Dorn were both highly, highly similar. And what's funny is that during the show they mentioned doppelgangers tend not to be just alike in how they look, they tend to have other similarities too. David and Darren, for example, are both homosexuals, which is not surprising. After all, we can see in the scientific literature that sexual orientation can be predicted based on facial structure. If you knew someone who also just happened to look almost exactly like David and Darren, well, then likely another homosexual man. John and Neil, they both went to college for religious education. One retired as a vicar. One got up to headmaster before retiring.
We both have sons who play the didgeridoo.
Both asked our wives to marry us after a very short time of knowing them.
We discovered we were both co-op bank members, clearly we have the same values right down to where we bank. Yes, but apart from that, we're different.
These doppelgangers are more similar to each other than you might expect. This is not just a double coincidence where these particular doppelgangers happen to look like each other and just happen to also act like each other at the same time. This is a pattern. People who look like each other consistently act more like each other and have values more consistent with each other. Now, of course, you and me, we don't take the position of like an honest forehead, sort of straightforward, face value, true, right? That doesn't make much sense. But doppelgangers are kind of too similar in their personality, so something has to be going on here, right? And what's happening here is the shape of your forehead, your brow, your nose, your jaw, your mouth. These are determined by your genetics. They're determined by your hormones during development. And those genetics and those hormones are also developing your brain, right? So it's not like if I break your nose and change its shape, you become a different person. But if two people have the hormones and genetics that shape a very similar nose, that will also, those genetics and those hormones will carry over to other parts of their body, including their brain. If you were to go to Iceland, an island in the Atlantic Ocean, you'd see the Icelanders. And the Icelanders look alike to some degree, right? Much more, the two Icelanders look way more alike than two random people in the world, right? Now, if you took 100 Icelanders and 100 people from Sardinia, that's an island, part of Italy, in the Mediterranean Sea, you would likely be able to tell who's the Sardinian, who's the Icelander by looking at them. But also, if you didn't get to look at them, if you only got to learn about their personalities, never heard their voices, never got to see them, but you just got lots of information about their values, their ideas, their disposition, and you would start to figure out that there are basically two groups forming. They are slightly different. Now, maybe a couple members of each of those groups would be harder to place. You might get a couple wrong if you had to guess, but you'd be probably decent at figuring out who is part of which group. Now, if we were to compare Icelanders to Norwegians, you would probably have a more difficult time. The personalities are more similar, but also they look more alike. Now, let's go further away. If we were to compare Icelanders to the Melanesian people of the Solomon Islands, those are islands in the Pacific Ocean, you might not get a single person wrong. These groups are just so different. You could find differences in temperament, personality, values, everything. And it's not really that surprising. We can just look at how different they look, right? They look so different. So the hormonal systems, the genetics that shaped their faces, that shaped their bodies, well, those also shaped their brains. Now, if we look outside of humans, have you ever noticed dogs have floppier ears than wolves? There's been a number of similarities between domesticated animals that have certain traits happen to them during their domestication. Dogs also often have curly tails. And in Russia, when they domesticated silver foxes in their experiments, they noticed that when they were selecting for foxes more friendly with people, the foxes started to develop floppy ears and curlier tails. They also developed lighter coloration, often piebald white patches. Maybe not exactly the same as a Holstein cow, but The genes that make animals look the way they do also are determining the way they act, their personalities, their temperament. When you select for behavior, you are accidentally sort of selecting for looks. And we know this more and more as we continue our research into behavioral genetics and evolutionary psychology. Now, that being said, if we compare wolves and foxes, that's a bigger stretch than two human groups, right? The more genetically distant two organisms are, the more it's possible that they could express similar characteristics without a similarity to the underlying genetics. For example, let's go back to the Icelanders and the Solomon Island Melanesians. Both of these groups can have blonde hair, right? So maybe there's some similarity there. It's certainly possible, although scientists have determined that the underlying genetics that created blonde hair in Europeans and the genetics that created blonde hair in Melanesians are actually two different two different genetic phenomena. So it is possible to have two phenotypical traits that produce the sort of same look to a certain feature, but are not genetically the same. Now, if we were to focus on more closely related human populations, like the Icelanders and the Dutch, right, most of their shared features are likely due to shared genes, right? The reason why some Icelanders are blonde and Dutch are blonde is actually the same reason. And these shared genetics create some amount of shared personality, a more shared value system, a more shared temperament. Now, if you were to go to a place like England, for example, if you were to look at the English people, the native English people, right, the white English, there is a range of looks they can take, right? They don't all look identical, right? You would also have a range of personalities. They don't all act identical. And just to get this out of the way, of course, they don't all get along either, right? But just because you don't get along doesn't mean you're not similar. Maybe you've seen two take charge, gotta run things personalities in the same room hating each other, even though they're very similar. Now, two random English people will look more like each other than two random people on Earth, or a random English person and a random Nigerian, or a random English person and a random Indian, right? On some level, we can talk about a collective English personality, right? There's a whole range of personalities all across the world, and temperaments and all these different facets of what makes you, you, but the English occupy only a portion of that. More broadly, we could look at groups of ethnic personalities that sort of fall more in line with each other. We could look at all of Europe, what you might call Western civilization. Spain, England, Austria, Greece, each has really their own different flavor of more or less the same basic thing, right? There's a sort of racial personality, a race soul, or a biospirit. Now, when I say biospirit, I'm not saying this is a mystical thing. We're talking about a segment of the total potential human temperament and personality. It's only a section of that that's tied to sort of a genetic population, in this case, like a race. Now, it's kind of obvious when Europeans came to North America, now the United States and Canada, they basically rebuilt Europe. It looks a lot like Europe, and it feels a lot like Europe. Now, when Chinese people have come to the United States, they don't have that same sort of Western biospirit. They have an Eastern soul. When they come to America, they rebuild China, right? They make Chinatowns. They reshape the environment based on their biospirit. Now, here in the United States, sometimes people like to look back to our past, our historical past, and they think of the space race, they think of us putting a man on the moon, especially the kind of people who said, "Make America great again." You know, they thought of our accomplishments, and they looked back at that time and they say, "Oh, look at how united we were back then." You know, back then there was sort of a common American narrative. We were Americans working together, advancing science, doing things that people told us were impossible.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. And I am delighted that this university is playing a part in putting a man on the moon as part of a great national effort of the United States of America.
But really, that interpretation of our history, that's not entirely true. It does seem like we were united, but it seems like that mostly because we were supermajority European, and we supermajority shared a biospirit. We were nearly all of the same genetic lineage. we nearly all expressed a lot of the same views. We had a more common personality and values. Now, there were other groups here that we're ignoring, right? If you say like, hey, look at how united we were, you're kind of ignoring these other groups. If we really look back, we see that a lot of these other groups, they weren't happy. They had different values. They were pushing back against white America. While white America was celebrating our heroes who were achieving spaceflight and the lunar landing, some other groups really hated it. There's different groups, different temperaments, different values, different personalities, and they're ultimately not all going to be united under your common narrative. Maybe every once in a while, there might be that like week and a half or month or right after 9/11 where everyone feels more united, but it kind of fades away quickly. You have those quick moments where these different biospirits kind of unite. They coalesce for a short amount of time, but for the most part, they're not united under a common narrative. If you want a united society where you look out for each other, where you feel a connection for each other, well, maybe you kind of have to have a connection with each other. On some level, if you want to be able to pull together in a crisis and really focus on your similarities without too much friction, well, maybe you kind of need to have a lot of similarities. Take a look at Japan. Japan, really well known for pulling together during disasters. They're a very, very, very high-functioning society, and it's, of course, not because they all have the same eyebrows, right? It's because they genuinely are alike. They're genetically, hormonally, biospiritually very similar to each other. You can tell by looking at them. As crude as that sounds, you can tell just by looking at them that they'll pull together well during a crisis. And the thing is, the Founding Fathers understood this. Look back at John Jay, Federalist Paper number 2. He described a united, high-functioning society in his day. Quote, Providence has been pleased to give this one connected country to one united people, a people descended from the same ancestors, speaking the same language, professing the same religion, attached to the same principles of government, very similar in their manners and customs. End quote. I mean, he was celebrating how similar we are and what an asset that was. And that really sort of changed over time, but mostly recently, right? Our immigration policy before the 1960s was chiefly an immigration policy of Northwestern Europe. Our founding fathers wrote, free white men of good character could come and be citizens, and no one else could be. The people who we received over the centuries had a shared biospirit with the people who were already here, for the most part. But things have changed a lot since the 1960s. They got rid of that. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, the so-called Hart-Celler Act, changed that. The people who supported the bill lied about it. They said it was not an attempt to change the racial makeup of America, but of course it was, right? Some people in the United States were discontented. They didn't like America the way it was, and they wanted to bring in people from all around the world to change our society, people who had different biospirits. And this has happened in Britain and all throughout Europe. Just look at Peter Hitchens. He wrote, quote, when I was a revolutionary Marxist, we were all in favor of as much immigration as possible. It wasn't because we liked immigrants, but because we didn't like Britain. We saw immigrants from anywhere as allies against the staid, settled, conservative society that our country was at the end of the 60s, end quote. Mass immigration from different biospirits is ultimately a weapon against the settled population, right? It's an attack. And here's another term for you, not just biospirit. In 1965, you had the Hart-Celler Act. This is attempted white erasure, right? When you're trying to push mass immigration to harm and erase the Western peoples, these white peoples, these European people, and destroy our biospirit, that's white erasure. Many of the people who said Make America Great Again do not realize that on some level, they want a united people, right? The only problem is the people of this country were never really united. That's a myth. When they say make America great again, they're thinking that we were united back in the day, but we weren't. It's just that some other groups were small enough, they didn't hold enough numbers, and they didn't hold positions of power to really disrupt the Western civilization order, the Western biospirit, the European spirit. They weren't able to bring a large force that would contend with that. They weren't able to assert their own biospirit in open political conflict. We didn't fight about if our town would be a mini Europe or a mini Africa or a mini Middle East or a mini East Asia. But now things are different. Maybe you've heard about the evils of what they call gentrification. Now, in the technical definition, that has to do with building things up, a lot of times renovating. But in the common parlance today, when they yell about the evils of gentrification, it has to do with white people moving into an area and they don't like it. It's a fight for dominance. This is our area, not your area, white people. Stay out. The people who said, make America great again, whether they can bring themselves to understand it or not, are ultimately saying, make America white again. Give us a united people again, where the conflicts are pretty much just fringe conflicts and they're small enough where we can ignore them. Give us a society where we don't have to constantly fight about the statues of our ancestors. Instead, we can just work together and we can be excited about new things. Maybe we could all get excited about the missions to Mars under Elon Musk. Let's focus on building new statues of our new heroes rather than tearing down the old ones. A lot of these Make America Great Again folks are wanting a place where people who hate our biospirit have no real power to tear down everything we've created. They might not understand it, but they don't like these foreign biospirits being here in such a large amount that Vox can pander to them and talk about the unbearable whiteness of American charities. White people are being too charitable. The New York Times can release articles about how baseball is so white and therefore bad. Well, this is only really possible with with a large number of people who hate our biospirits and a lot of people who are working against it. At the end of the day, I hope you get to live in a high-functioning society someday where people can really pull together in a crisis and focus on their similarities. But that does mean that you will need to live in a society where people have a lot of similarities. You'll need to live somewhere where people look like you. You'll need to live somewhere where people share your biospirit and no one's trying to erase your people. No one's trying to white erase you and everything that your people have been.